Hello, I'm Daniel Herbert, the managing editor of Boxing News, and I'm going to talk about how we make the flashback page. Every week we have a page in the magazine where we look back at boxing news from it could be any year in the past, and we pick out the best stories, the most interesting stories that happened that week. For example, this week is February the 14th, 1964. In those days it was black and white, a little bit of red, spot colour as we called it. Really the good old days, 49 years ago, almost half a century, and names like Henry Cooper fighting, and the front page about Henry Cooper and his potential rivals in Britain. Brian London, Joe Erskine, Johnny Prescott, Billy Walker, some of the great names of British boxing history. So I'll look back inside the paper. In those days the layout was a bit different. We had started off with domestic news, and then we'd have reports further back. Obviously, depending on what happened, it can vary from week to week. We have a report from Bermondsey. So, well, we had the column on page 6, letters page. Well, that's a classic. The letters is always there. It's always been there throughout the history of boxing news. We've had around the gyms, gossip. Then we have a double-page spread, Sonny Liston, Muhammad Ali, or Cassius Clay as he was then. That was a fight coming up about a week or 10 days later, but we had this in the week before the preview. That would be interesting. This we had an around the globe section, little small stories from fight action all around the world, particularly America, Europe. That's very big news in those days, and some results even. And then we go back to the amateur section. In those days the paper was 16 pages, the amateurs page 13, we only had 3 pages. The ABA Championship starting, that's quite interesting for the amateur game. It was really big news in those days. Onto page 16, we had news and reports on the back page. We only had 16 pages, now we have 48, so in those days we had to cram everything in. It's a real effort to fit everything in the paper, but some great stories there. In the Telefight News, Ron Olver's column, he's looking forward to Sonny Liston. We had Joey Archer there, who was a big name in the middleweights in the 60s, fought Sugar Ray Robinson, people like that. Some great stuff. In those days, it was probably more copy than pictures. It's harder to get live pictures of the top class fighters, particularly from overseas. So, tend to have more print than photographs. That's something that's changed, the last few years. But we've got plenty of results and information from around the world. I mean, worldwide results, South America, the Far East, Tokyo, Manila. I mean, it's all crammed in. We had so much news in those days. Also, we used to have like a regular feature, like a boxer's record, Ray's Shield, St. Helens heavyweight. That was a very popular feature in those days. Nowadays, you have Box Rec and the internet, and people look that up themselves. But in those days, that was the only way of finding out a boxer's record, was to type it out and put it in Boxing News. Yeah, and here we have advertising as a special little booklet coming out with the Liston Clay fight, as we called it. Looking ahead to that. Of course, Sonny Liston was a massive favourite. A lot of people thought that fight was a mismatch, but it didn't turn out that way. And of course, Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, as he was, went on to have a fabulous career. We'll fill the pages of Boxing News for the next 20-odd years. So. Interesting. One of the problems with the old papers when we're looking through them is that the old newsprint tends to crumble slightly around the edges and yellows, but that's something we can't really control. So we just have to be very, very careful about turning the pages and looking in the old magazines. So Walter McGowan, he was a big name from the 1960s. Was British champion, became world champion. He's a big star. Yeah. So we had like some cigarette cards or posters of great fighters. 22 heavyweight champions of the century. Special price, 7 shillings. When those in the days when everybody knew who world heavyweight champions were, and now of course things are a bit different, but they were the huge stars back in those days, the 60s. We're talking about half a century ago now, aren't we? Yeah, there's so much fascinating stuff here, so many good stories, and you can just start reading and keep on reading for all day if you had the time. But what we have to do in the flashback is just pick out the best stories, the ones that will interest readers. I mean, some of them are domestic stories, interest British readers. Also try and have some American stories to interest people outside the UK. Some people like Cassius Clay, and they have a worldwide appeal. But, we have American fighters or Canadian fighters would be interesting, and not just the big stars either. Like Here's a story about Carmen Brasilio doing matchmaking for a show, and the lead fighter on that show is his brother Joey Basilio, so that's an interesting story. Joey Archer again. But these are days when the top fighters used to fight every couple of months, so they'll be in and out of here every few weeks. Marty Marshall, the man who beat Sonny Liston, he's talking about having a comeback in Canada. I think that got cancelled because he was too old and the Canadian Commission wouldn't allow him to fight there. That's an interesting story. So Fraser Tawil in South Africa, part of the famous Tawil boxing family. He's in a story there, that's quite interesting. Emil Griffith having a non-title fight. Yeah, just so many great names. They just leap out at you. We have to try and pick out a few of the big names and put them in little stories in Flashback and try and get a picture if we can. Going back 50 years, it can be difficult, so we try and pick a story where we know we're going to have a picture to go with that story, and so it makes an interesting nostalgia page. And everybody likes nostalgia, don't they? So even the younger generation can look back at the history of the sport. I mean, boxing as a sport has such a great history going back to the 1890s, so there's always something there that can interest somebody. Yeah, that's how I make the Flashback page.
Get involved with all the best boxing banter at our forum, and that's forum.boxingnewsonline.net.